You're listening to Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle, Washington.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of JBC Connect. I have two good friends here joining me, Reverend Paul Schneider and Reverend Dr. Bob Reid. It's a real pleasure to have both of them here on this episode. And I'm going to frame today. We're going to do something a little different. We're actually going to talk about a new series that came out on Netflix called Midnight Mass. And I'm going to just tell you the most important thing before we do anything else is that there's spoilers. We're going to talk about the whole thing from start to finish. So if you want to really engage in it, you're welcome to watch it, but don't feel the pressure either. We're not endorsing it necessarily, but we just felt that there was a lot of interesting topics and conversations that could come up. And I'm going to talk hopefully a little bit at the end about why these kind of conversations about pop culture are really important. So I thought it was a very thought-provoking, very ambitious series. And before we get into that, I thought it'd be great to maybe introduce two of my friends here before we go too far into our conversation. So maybe Paul and then Bob, you could just tell a little bit about yourself for those who may not be as familiar with you.
Hi, I'm Reverend Paul Schneider. I am the pastor of Burien Community Church in Burien, Washington, and I am currently doing doctoral work at the Berkeley School of Theology around the intersections of faith and pop culture.
Right.
Hi, I'm Bob Reid, and I am retired at this point, an emeritus professor who was the department chair of a communication department and also the director of a graduate degree program. And I have, since in the last 6 years, living in the Seattle area, have been doing interim pastorate since my initial occupation in life had also been to be a pastor. And so with that, I bring both theology and some understanding of some of the things that go on with communication and popular culture to bear.
Great. And so I want to just preface a bit this whole time together with just like our general impressions of the series. And I want everyone to know is like, I actually had no idea about Midnight Mass. I didn't know about it because I was just doing a presentation at our annual meeting for our pastors. And Bob was in the discussion and he just said, like, have you heard about Midnight Mass? Like, it's touching on these really amazing, like sociological, theological, philosophical points. And I was like, wow, I've never heard of it. And he says, like, this would be great for a podcast. And then Paul, you wrote to me soon after that saying, like, I would love to be a part of this kind of discussion. This is exactly what I'm studying. This is what I'm passionate about. And then I was like, okay, well, let's do it. And then I finally just clicked on like, well, what is Midnight Mass? And then I'm like, oh, okay. It's actually like a supernatural, like mystery, suspense, horror, something. And I was like, I had no idea. So, and that's but that was kind of exciting about it, just like I'm gonna dive into this. I have no connection, and I did all my research I did about it was actually after I watched it, and I didn't realize he was connected to this movie or this series, so it's really fascinating. I guess my quick general impressions of it is when I was watching it, the immediate feel and thought I had was, because actually I don't know if you both of you know, I'm very interested in film studies. I freelance soundtrack compose for indie films, and I've always loved film from a young age. And so I love high culture, low culture. So when I'm watching Midnight Mass, I was immediately thinking of The Exorcist. These um, these films that kind of use a genre, and then there's moments of like what I call like transcendence, where they kind of like subvert their genre, and you all of a sudden realize you're talking about so much more. You know, I think also of like Solaris, the Russian sci-fi film that definitely did things like that. We were just talking about Dune, Paul, like just these moments where you think it's a certain genre and you kind of boxed it in, and then you realize, oh, it's so much more than that. It's really transcending genres to talk about so much more. And so it was quite a ride. I think it was a bit of a longer arc. It was hard for me to watch because like I had like a theologian in me talking like as I was watching it, but then I had a pastor in me watching. And then I also have like a film kind of critique going on too. So I'm like there was moments where I was like, oh, like the dialogue or the timing or the editing, I didn't feel good about, but the content of this dialogue was amazing. But then what does that say theologically? So I felt like I was watching this film constantly on like four levels, if that makes sense, which but I walked away thinking like, this is profoundly ambitious. I think sometimes it really lands. Not always, I felt some ways too, but what it's talking about was really interesting, and the timing of it when it came out is really interesting to me as well. So, just some general thoughts, and we'll get into that. But maybe Paul, I thought I'd just hand it over to you. What were some of your general impressions about Midnight Mass as a whole?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so like you, I came to it kind of with only the vaguest idea of what it was. I knew it was something that was pretty popular. I could see that it was up there in the Netflix rankings and everything. One of the things that kind of caught me out right away as a pastor was that all of the episode titles were books of the Bible. And I was like, okay, so they're deliberately framing this in these terms. So then, how does that change how I'm thinking about this? And so, like you, I kind of had that multivalent experience with it, where I was looking at it at multiple levels. One of the things that really caught me out and it really bugged me until I realized it was just an error, and I've almost let it go, was that in the first episode she says it's the seventh Sunday of Ordinary Time, which happens after Pentecost, and I think she actually meant to say that it was the seventh Sunday of Epiphany Tide, or after Epiphany, which
Oh yeah,
but it
yeah.
bugged me. It bugged me for a while, and
Right.
I was watching this with my eldest kid, and so periodically I'd pause it and I'd go off about some church thing that I was like, that didn't line up the way it was supposed to. But for the most part, I was actually really thrilled by it, and I thought that one of the things that it did really well was it was a sincere attempt to look at faith, both the good and the bad of it, right? The positives and the negatives, and the ways that faith can be something that lifts people up from despair, and also the ways that faith can be twisted and weaponized. And so, to me, I mean, I think we're living in a society these days where that happens with faith quite regularly. Both, again, the lifting up from despair and the weaponizing of faith, and so it made it all that much more relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Lots of really good things in there. Hopefully, we'll get to swing back to some of those things you talked about, Paul, because I definitely agree with you. And I did not catch that liturgical calendar. Good for you. Good for you. Good pastor. Anyways, Bob, I want to hand it over to you. What were some of your general impressions of the series?
To frame what I want to say about general impressions, I first want to draw on a comment that you made when we were early watching. When I first suggested this, you said, "Oh, horror, that's not my genre. I don't like watching stuff like that." And one of the things I discovered a number of years ago is that genres like that, or certain science fiction and stuff like that, they allow people to ask questions and explore questions of meaning and purpose and identity in ways that your police procedural, your whatever the other kind of genres that are out there, they don't do that. And so one of the things, I don't know that all horror does this, but occasionally you'll find somebody who's doing this, that is actually their purpose, that the horror story, in a sense, is secondary to the larger question that they're asking about meaning and purpose in life. And boy, this series, to me, really engages that. There are long conversations that some of the characters have about whether faith matters or doesn't matter, whether religion even matters anymore or doesn't matter. And for me, what I find is that is exactly the question that we in the church need to be asking as well, because we are at a tipping point, I think, from almost 2,000 years of doing Christianity, and doing religion in a certain kind of way inside the box. And I think right now we're really asking some questions about what does religion, what does Christianity or faith look like that isn't necessarily, quote, religion, at least how we previously understood it. And genres like this in the popular culture, even when they're done by people who are asking their questions just as a layperson trying to figure this out for themselves, pose, I think, interesting points of conversation for us to begin to see our way of people who've been trained to be in the box, to look at religion and think this and figure out lectionary and all those kinds of things. These people aren't caught up in those kind of questions. They're asking deeper questions about life and whether how does life matter? How is there a possibility of redemption for things in our life? Can we ever find forgiveness if we've done terrible things? Oh, how does one understand what your life is even supposed to be? I think sometimes popular culture, especially when it's not particularly intending to be moralistically religion, can pose some of those questions in some of its art and its media and film. And I think when it does, that's powerful. My son, who has passed away, when I was living in Iowa and he was living out here in the East Coast, we were trying to talk and have some things to talk because you can talk for an hour, right? And now with cell phones and all that. So one of the things I found to connect with him is that I learned that one of the television programs he was in love with, as a person who was not particularly interested in faith, I realized after watching a couple of episodes just to have something to talk with him, was the most religious program on TV. It's called The Walking Dead. And I thought it was the most religious program on TV because every episode had only one question at the heart of it. How can you find hope in a world where there's no hope? Every episode was people struggling to figure out if there's hope. They weren't necessarily finding it religion, but they were desperately looking for hope. And I think Christianity was born in a world where people were looking for hope. So pop
Yeah.
culture things for that, I think, are fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's, well, maybe we should just kind of, this maybe should be the opening question. I kind of wanted to land here at the end, but what you're talking about is really what I agree with. And that's why I was also mentioning The Exorcist, because The Exorcist is definitely in the genre of horror, but I definitely had moments when I was watching it, the scene where like, I think there's just like a brief pause, like before the final exorcism where, the priest is talking about like, why does God let, these things happen? And you just get this very like transcendent moment. You're like, oh, this is actually so much more than just horror, like, and gore. And I think that's what is the most exciting thing about arts, is like what you're talking about, is like the subversiveness, right? Like, I think Eugene Peterson talks about subversive spirituality, like you're telling it slant. So it's almost like it gets around our original, I guess, walls and borders, right? And kind of finds a way to go around, and like it lets down our defenses. Interestingly, Bob, what you're talking about, I read an article about someone who's actually offended by midnight mass, because they said, I go to midnight mass to get away from religion. I go there to not talk about these things, and I feel like you ambushed me and you made me like talk with God or something like that. And they felt like deceived, and they were very upset about this thing because like it was so religious and so heavy. Like I came for a horror, a good horror, and you didn't give it to me. And so I think that's kind of interesting, right? But like that kind of person probably would not have wanted to engage because like she was traumatized by religion. And so it's interesting how the arts can kind of create these conversations that we never have chosen willingly, maybe, but to talk about greater things. Um, and I think that's really exciting. And Paul, I wonder if it's interesting, like if you wanted to talk a bit more about like your fascination with doing your doctoral on this like intersection of like pop and theology, like what brought you to that?
Sure. So, I mean, I've been deeply rooted in pop culture. We all are, whether or not we're really aware of it, right? It, to some degree, is the water we're swimming in,
Hmm.
and like the fish, we're not really aware of that fact. But as I was working my way through seminary, getting my master's of divinity, I came to realize that a lot of these things that I had taken for granted, these things that I had still found very formative, had these sort of spiritual implications to them. And some of that was because I was who I was when I encountered it, but some of that was just they were deliberately written to provoke those kinds of questions, or at least opened the door to it if you were interested in that. But I think that the church writ large has largely stepped away from pop culture. There's this sense that's of the world and in the world, and therefore it has no business in the church. And I just don't find that perception to be particularly helpful. If the goal of the church is to communicate the gospel, right? To communicate the good news, then we need to do it in the language that the people are speaking, right? This is why Luther wrote the Bible in German, why Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. They realized that that being able to hear these words with the language and the stories in their own language, in someone's native language, really made a difference. And the meaning making stories that we find in pop culture, that's kind of the language of today. And for the church to not engage them, I think is not only irresponsible, but is largely kind of explains why the church seems to be farther and farther and farther away from where the culture is. And so my work is kind of just beginning. I just enrolled in the program, but a lot of what I'm looking to do is to figure out, how do we as the church begin to bridge that divide, not for the purposes of doing something underhanded or sneakily, sharing the gospel with someone, but really, engaging with it authentically so that we can share the gospel in authentic ways through stories that are already out there, through stories that already exist and have meaning for people in their lives.
Yeah, that's great. It's kind of funny. I was listening to some interviews with Mike Flanagan, right? And it's also something I've been thinking about too, is like, just to let some of our listeners know, if you haven't seen Midnight Mass, like, look, there's strong language, like there's gore, right? It's about vampires, right? I'm sorry, spoilers, right? But they don't use the word. They actually intentionally don't use the word vampire. But anyways, um, and a lot of Mike Flanagan says, and I also say, is like, if you get offended by that, it's like, have you looked at the Bible? I mean, the Bible's very gory. I mean, it's very like mystical. I mean, it's very violent. And I think the Bible is actually a lot more in line with like our popular culture than we realize, and I think, and then there's a lot of like sex, there's like a lot of shocking material in the Bible. And I think the sooner we realize that the Bible is probably more honest about our world than we are, the more willing we'll be to engage in things like you're talking about. So this kind of like goes into something that I wanted to touch on
Can
at the
I
beginning.
jump in
Oh
just
yeah,
for a
yeah,
second?
please go ahead, Bob.
I want to pick up on one thing that Paul said.
Yeah.
As Paul was talking about the need to engage where the culture is actually at, we all have probably heard this somewhere along the way, but it is worth remembering. At the Reformation, Luther made the decision that maybe we need to find ways to include the people a little bit more, and he wanted to do singing. And so where did he get the songs? From the local taverns.
Mm.
And he wrote theological music to them, but he drew people in. Turning to things like this in our culture right now is no different than what Luther was doing back when we created Protestant Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to find ways to engage people where they are, and then invite them to reflect on the deepest, most important questions of life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think there's some really great questions that are brought up in this series that are worth looking into. And the first one I wanted to tackle, and this is very impressive to me, was their use of scripture and the connection of like scripture and institution of religion. Like, and I think that they're trying to do is like show like there are actually, even within the church, there's like an institution of human organization and an institution of spirituality, right? And I found that it was very nuanced, but there was like this kind of like two ways of using scripture there. And I was very like, because I've seen like a lot of films and I've seen how scripture is used all the time in pop culture, but you could definitely see like Mike Flanagan's writing was like a level above most people when they incorporate scripture. Even when it was used like out of context, it was used like very well, like it was very thoughtful. Um, and he didn't just like kind of proof text, just like drop in like his favorite verse. He really kind of went for it through that Bev character. And I was just thinking a lot about how so much of how we define our institution of faith, whether that be physical or spiritual, is really our use of scripture, like the formation, like how scripture actually really forms a community. And I was just wondering like some of your thoughts about, the use of scripture um, in the series, because I almost feel like the Bible is like, it's almost like a main character, I thought, uh, in the series. And so I was just wondering some of your thoughts about the use of scripture throughout the series.
So I mean, one of the things that I really liked was that we both saw scripture used in ways that lifted up its context, and then also scripture intentionally ripped out of context, right?
Hmm.
And that so the character of Bev Keane, when she needed to, she wielded scripture like a club, right?
Hmm.
And we've all seen that happen, maybe even in our churches. But certainly within our culture writ large, and but then we also saw people who treated scripture, taking into account the fullness of its context, and for all that especially as the series progresses, the theology of the sermons that Father Paul is giving becomes questionable. They are in fact grounded in the scriptures that he's lifting up beforehand, which is not something that always happens in pop culture representations of religion, and particularly of preaching. So I was appreciative of that.
Hmm. Yeah, I know, absolutely, for sure. I think you were mentioning about like that weaponization of scripture. I think you definitely saw like a master class in how to do that. But then you also saw kind of like this interesting counter narrative. And I wonder if people aren't listening to the script carefully, that you're seeing these two different ways. Like I remember there was a moment where Aaron Green is kind of saying like, I'm gonna go back into the town to save people. And there's no greater love than that, right? I mean, that's what the good book says. And I was like, she was trying to do it very like off the cuff, but I was like, wow, that's a really powerful counter use of scripture to like the weaponization that you see in the Bev character. And that was, so I think that's just like a really kudos to the writer, like just trying to figure out how to do that. But to the uninterested, you might blanket all of that. But I think if you lean in a bit, like he's very aware of like there are life-giving ways to use scripture, and also like ways that it can really take life too. Bob, when we were talking about very briefly in that Zoom session, like you had identified so many theological themes. And I was wondering, like, was there one theological theme that really stood out to you that was like, wow, this is a really profound way of how they're expressing this in a new way?
I certainly think that it's not much of a spoiler if it's the first 5 minutes of the entire series, as you open up looking at a car with the fish on the
Yes.
bumper and pull back from this. So that tells you where you're going from the very first moment of the film to a guy sitting on the curb who you quickly realize is handcuffed, looking over at the girl he's just hit with his car, trying to resuscitate her. And frankly, in a matter of the first 2 minutes of the film, you realize this is a tragedy in a sense for this person, because everything that his life had been is now changed, and he has to come to terms with who he always thought he was and who he had become, and what he had done, and whether there could ever be any redemption for a person who has done something like this. In one sense, what begins as a story of personal redemption ends up being a question of redemption for our culture, in terms of Bev on one hand and Aaron on the other hand, ending up being in some ways more the main characters who are playing out religion with its literalism versus a kind of a view of faith that is more simple, and yet asking the deeply profound questions of what faith is supposed to be about. So there's sacrifice, there's redemption, there are, as you just said, Sam, moments where people are doing things that are at the heart of scripture: to love thy neighbor as thyself, rather than act selfishly, to act selflessly. So all of these kind of deeply embedded theological themes are coming out, and they're coming out not because somebody went to seminary and figured out how to do the church. They're coming out from a person who grew up in the church, struggled with what the church is, and now trying to figure out, but what is there in there that is the kernel that is so terribly important that he must keep it, versus the stuff that just looks like it goes crazy. And for me, that's what this whole episode is. They just use the horror genre as a venue to get there, because it with all those scriptures that Paul was talking about a minute ago that could be overly read with a literalism, it's there. It's there kind of to be made stuff out of. And so the other theme that comes out is you see this two ways of going about life. One that is self-sacrificial, trying to help others, versus one that is self-centered and trying to just figure out why we're the right tribe.
Yeah.
and we're going to do our tribal thing, and we don't care about anybody else. I think that there's other religions that are brought into this in an interesting way. One of the main characters is also from a different faith, struggling with what that means. All of these things are in here in this series, and those questions are the heart of the story, for which horror is just used as the genre that can explore it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think you've really hit on it. Like if I could say like one of the strongest themes of this series is probably the concept of redemption. And I don't know if you did this, but if you know this already, but I did some research about Midnight Mass just to prepare for today. And I didn't realize that this story is actually very personal to Mike Flanagan. He says this is his most personal thing. He actually he struggled with alcoholism. And he said that one of his greatest fears was if his addiction overtook him and he actually killed somebody and he lived. And so a lot of this was learning how to what is involved in recovery, redemption, and forgiving yourself, and forgiving others. And there are so many poignant moments, right? Like I also have tried to read a couple of critiques, and like going to the end. You just talked about the beginning. I'm going to go right to the end because I'm mean. So remember, I already told you spoilers. But one critic said like they were very unhappy about this film because they didn't like how the end. Everyone's just singing "Near My God to Thee," just looking at the sunset. It's a beautiful scene, and it seems like everything's washed away. But I don't think that at all, because a lot of why the last couple of episodes are so gory is to see like we are just awful, ugly people, all of us. And like I think that scene where Bev has her hands covered in blood, I immediately think of like Shakespeare and Macbeth, right? Like Lady Macbeth and her hands are blood. Like it's kind of all of us have some kind of blood on our hands. And there was this profound moment near the end where, one of the teenagers says like, I think I killed my mom. Like he's covered in blood. He's like, I've done some bad things. Another person says, I've done some bad things. And like, this is literally the sacrament of like, confession. And I was just thinking a lot about how, what is it? We're in such a world. Like I don't think he avows to be religiously Catholic anymore. I don't know if he defined himself as religious, but he's profoundly shaped by Catholicism.
And he's a seeker.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I didn't find out my research, but yeah, if he is, it makes total sense because you you get the sense is like all of us, like take away all the religious trappings, all of us are looking like for redemption. We're looking for someone to say, "I forgive you." Right? There's something so compelling about that scene. I was also thinking about the movie Magnolia. It kind of ends off with that phrase of just saying like, in the end, I think we just all want to be forgiven. And it's like you feel like when you hear that like in this film, it's like this is a profoundly spiritual religious moment. It's like we're all looking for that path to redemption. And I think that is really done thoughtfully throughout, and I'm really impressed by it.
You sent me an article that talked to, and the very last part of that, in the last paragraph, uh, the director writer of this thing says that that's why I'm calling him a seeker. He said, I've come to the point where working my faith and or what faith there was that I was raised with and what my questions are now to realize that there are two questions that are fundamental. What kind of person am I really going to be, and what's going to happen after death? Those are what he says, two central questions to
Hmm.
faith. And then he finally says, and I'm working on that first one. I don't know that I have any answers about the second one, but the one thing I do understand is what that second question really is just answered in many ways by the first one. What's going to happen after death is really just really a matter of who you choose, whether you choose to be this selfless person or selfish person or whatever in life. That what meaning there is in life is going to be what meaning there is in any life beyond life.
Hmm.
Whatever that second thing is can't be separated from the first thing. And that is a profoundly religious worldview that I think is fascinating, which is why I say he's a seeker. He's just not going to do it inside the box that we've created called religion in
Yeah.
the traditional sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that brings us to maybe like kind of another thing that I saw as a really strong theme in Midnight Mass is like this whole concept of like what is life, what is death, what is afterlife. And this is the genius of Midnight Mass. Like I totally admit is that the genre of vampire folklore is perfect for this, right? Because you're talking about death, undead, right? Like coming back to life. And of course, how do they come back to life? Is through the ingestion of blood, right? Through the devouring of flesh. It's so,
Breaking the body.
yeah, breaking the body, literally. And so, like, there's so much rich metaphor here that fits so perfectly with Christianity, but at the same time is completely dissonant with like the Christian message. So it's brilliant. It's like a wonderful genre of just smashing these two together because they have so much in common. And I think Bobby really touched on this really interesting thing of like what is life, because like I think a traditional understanding of life is like, well, we're all waiting for the afterlife. Do we get to heaven or not? But it's pretty evident that some people are kind of like living in hell even though they're alive right now, you know, and even though they come back to life, they haven't really changed, or they have completely changed. And so it's kind of like all these interesting questions of the afterlife. I was wondering, Paul, I mean, what were your thoughts about, uh, because I want to ask both of you, but I want to start with Paul. Is like, there's two very profound scenes where they talk about what do you think happens when you die, right? Um, and it's a very risky move because like if you look at the edits like directorially, like it's a very long edit. It's a lot of words. That's a risky thing for a director to do, a writer to do, to have a scene with that many words. But I think it was a very compelling scene, both of them. But I was just thinking maybe your thoughts, you know, cinematically or theologically or whatever. But maybe Paul, did you have any thoughts about those kind of monologues about, you know, what happens when you die?
Sure. So one of the things that I really appreciate that Mike Flanagan did is that he refused to set up anyone as a straw man. There were
Yeah.
no straw man atheists. There was no straw man. You know, one of the characters is Muslim. You know, he wasn't a straw man either. You know, two of the characters were Muslim actually. And certainly, you know, while we saw different kinds of people of faith within the Catholic or you know Christian writ large church that they represented, you know, there weren't really any straw men there either, right? And so you end up with this profound moment where there's this conversation happening between Riley and Aaron, who are people who have loved each other in the past, who are maybe finding their way towards loving each other again. And I think it's important that that scene starts with Aaron thanking Riley for praying with her all day. And, you know, she says, I know that doesn't mean anything for you. And he says, no, but I get the sense of comfort from it, right? I understand why you wanted to pray. And so I was going to pray with you because that's what you wanted to do. I'm paraphrasing, but then you end up having this deep conversation. They ask each other this critical question: what happens when we die? And they each have their own unique answers. And Riley answers from a very sort of scientific, atheistic perspective, but even within that, it's still a spiritual perspective.
Very spiritual.
Yeah. Very spiritual.
And you know that I really appreciated because I know plenty of very spiritual people who don't believe in God at all. And so yeah, I mean, I that scene in particular, I agree, it was very risky. Not only that, because you might alienate a portion of your audience, you know, because you gave the quote unquote wrong answer, right? I also really appreciated the fact that we actually don't see that whole scene. We see part of it, and then we get it reprised at the very end. We get her answer about what she thinks happens for herself, right? Because when she answers, she doesn't answer on her own behalf, but on behalf of the child who is now no longer there in her womb, you know, which and I thought that both of their answers were both, you know, grounded and also worthy, you know. While I think I tend to agree more with Aaron's answer personally, coming from a place of faith, then you know, neither of the answers was, you know, just oh well, and then we die, right?
Yeah, what was so impressive about it was like it was so vulnerable, wasn't it? Because I think the real powerful thing for both of them was like they acknowledged like we just don't know, and you know this is what we are pining for. This is what we feel in our spirit that we're longing for. And I think that just that disarming honesty, that vulnerability is very compelling. So I think it was a very powerful scene.
I want to
Yeah,
jump
Bob, what are your
and
thoughts?
say that if you're talking about creating a narrative arc from beginning to end and the movements of it, that conversation is the utter center of this entire series.
Right.
Everything that the series moved to is that conversation. And if you didn't know it, even though the design tells you that, uh, the very fact that Paul said that something happens at the very end where that conversation gets revisited tells you it was the climactic moment of the entire series, which is why a question about what happens when we die as the climactic center of a this is a deeply spiritual
Mhm.
investigation. And if you didn't get it, you knew it then. And so that's why I was profoundly moved when I watched this to say that I find it to be an important show in terms of investigating, in a sense, what spirituality and religion and the questions that we ought to be asking one another out there without trying to push some kind of literalistic religious worldview down somebody's throat. What are the deep questions that hunger in people's souls that we should be asking? And how do we conduct those questions in meaningful ways? This series, for all of it's really trying to do that with real conversations between people, really trying to talk their way through this and understand one another. And boy, if we are asking where does the church need to be right now, or at least not the church, where does Christianity need to be right now, or world religions need to be right now? That's where we need to be.
Yeah, and Bob, this is a really great way that you're putting it because I do feel like that was a central moment in the series. And it's interesting, isn't it? During this conversation, you can barely hear it, but it's almost like 3 times slower speed. But the song that's being played in the background is actually Near My God to Thee, right? And then at the end of why I think that actually the final scenes of the series are powerful is because they reprise that with everyone singing that song. And it isn't those conversations talking about like how can I get near what is that my how can I become nearer in my approach to divinity, right, to God, right? And that's a very ambitious thing to do like in a vampire like series, but they really are asking that big question of like what does it mean to come near to God. And there seems to be this connection of like it's about kind of like peace with self, like redemption of like the quality of what is new life, like unpacking all these amazing things and in ways that are definitely not like traditional church. Um, and I think like it also shows the humility of like what is nearness to God like? I mean, I think of C.S. Lewis talking about nearness to God by proximity and approach. Like a lot of us think we're getting closer to God by proximity, but we're actually even farther away. But like, what does it mean to really approach nearer to like this divine grace? I think is really powerful. There's so much good stuff here. Everyone is saying. I do want to throw in one more thing that I found so compelling. I can't resist talking about this, and I probably should wrap up, or else we're going to talk about this for years. But this powerful connection between free will and determinism. I found this is really in there. And why I want to talk about this, because I think it's brilliant how they've done this on multiple levels again. Because, Flanagan was an alcoholic. He talked about his recovery process and this whole thing about recovery and addiction. And what, there's so much great material in the vampire folklore again about this bloodlust, right? This desire for blood. Like it's an addiction. Riley struggles with addiction. And then I immediately thought of the scriptures about Paul talking about, I do what I do not want to do, right? And the very thing I don't want to do, I do, right? And it's talking about, are we stuck? Like, are we trapped in like some kind of determined, are we enslaved to the addiction, right? And in theological terms, right? The addiction of sin, right? And or do we have some kind of like free will? And that's why I thought it was really interesting. There's a very brief scene when like Riley's parents become vampires and they talk about like I feel the hunger, but you don't have to do it. You can still choose. Like, and it kind of talks about like also a really interesting thing about like the new life and the new creation is that even when we kind of become a new creation, we still have choices, and though we do have inclinations, we do have hungers. And so I thought it was like just a really thoughtful thing. I don't think it gives answers, but more like questions, talking about like, can you balance? Like, it's not just like you are doomed to be like a victim of your determined, passions, but also you also have agency, you have choice. And then even when you make bad choices, there's a lot of space for grace and compassion. And I thought that was really profound. I mean, I think I was very impressed by the nuance of that and like the multi layers of that. That was very compelling to me. And I was just wondering, like, any thoughts you folks had on it, like, just bring that together. I know that was a mouthful, but
So I really thought that a big part of the story, in terms of Riley's redemption, right, of his redemption arc, comes down to him making the choice to own
that's
his
right.
decisions. And we see it. There's an AA meeting that he has with the father where he's having this conversation, and he
Yeah,
talks about how there's this other guy, this jerk who comes out who does things, and then all of a sudden, like it's like he catches himself, and then he goes, "No, that's me."
that's right.
And he owns it. And then when he goes out on the boat with Aaron
Yeah.
after his resurrection,
Hmm.
he's in the position to essentially fall off the wagon again, right? to give in to what comes next, and
Right.
instead he chooses to own his stuff. And he says, I'm out here. So
Yeah.
Riley, the the series opens with the Jesus fish, and it pans out, and we see the girl. And every night before he goes to sleep, we're given to understand that Riley sees this girl.
Yeah.
That's the same girl who comes to Riley after
Yeah.
he,
Horribly disfigured by the
right,
accident, right? Yeah.
horribly disfigured by the accident,
Found on.
and her whole,
Yeah.
restored, is the one who comes to escort Riley, or at
Yeah.
least shows up to Riley in those last moments,
Yeah.
reaching out a hand for him,
Yeah.
as he gives his life, right, as
Yeah.
he chooses another path.
Yeah.
um, and that to me was incredibly powerful.
Yes.
I will honestly say that I was crying,
Yeah.
as I watched it.
Yeah.
It's a
That,
redemption.
yeah,
And the
that's
other thing
poignant.
is, for those anybody who's listening to this and say, "Oh, I don't want to watch a vampire series," the vampire is just a way to encapsulate the temptations of evil.
Yeah.
And that the temptations of evil come to us not inviting us to become evil, they invite us to become more, to be better, to have more, but they're always self-centered in terms of your need, your hunger to have more. Hunger here being encapsulated by that kind of vampire need to feed on others. But there's a sense. So what you have is the free will of some people saying, just because we've been cast into this evil does not mean we have to choose to be evil.
Yeah. That's
I
very
mean,
profound. Yeah.
when we start unpacking this entire thing is just the most profound, one of the most profound, far more than The Exorcist or something like that. This is a profound story about where might we think about the nature of faith today, in terms of whether you're doing it spiritually in a scientific way or spiritually in a faith-based way. How does one find oneself getting redemption, finding meaning, and choosing not to just be overtaken by evil and live self-centered rather than selfless lives? We are called to be selfless.
Yeah, this is interesting too because what you're talking about, like the director and producer intentionally told the cast, and they made a like a ground rule, like we're not going to use the word vampire intentionally because if you use that, you're going to bring all that folklore into it, and we only want to actually call it the angel. That's it, which is an interesting choice, right? Because if you know the word angel, right, it means like messenger, right? It's a literal translation of messenger, right? So it's about like what is the message that's being spoken. So the 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 vehicle of the vampire, this is not like a true vampire movie because it's not about vampires. It's about, they're using this folklore, but it's about like what is this message and what do we do with the message, right? Is kind of what you're talking about, Bob, which I think you said really well. Is like what are the choices we make when we receive this opportunity? Like, does it change us for the better or does it change us for the worse? Because like everyone receives the message of the angel, right? And you see what it does to a lot of the town folk, and like the horror and the gore that comes after. But then you also see like how actually the message can also be a path to redemption, right? Like you see at the end for Aaron and for Riley, and that boat scene. I actually literally watched it a couple of times. I don't know. I had to keep watching it because like it was so powerful. I kind of wanted to soak in it for a bit. Um, and the fact is like all he needed to say was like I tried, and then that was enough, and he did the right thing, and redemption was granted to him. Like the girl appears to him whole and complete, and all these interesting metaphors of like sunrise,
Oh,
a divine, kind of encounter, all this stuff, amazing stuff. So anyways, uh there's so many more things to say, and I'm even contemplating like, do we need to have more episodes about this? But Paul and I were actually talking like maybe we're onto something. Like I really enjoy doing this, like just talking about culture and theology. It's something I've always been passionate about, even in my music uh and in other genres of art. So I definitely don't want to feel like we're bringing this conversation to a close, but maybe it's kind of like a doorway going forward. So I'm just so thankful for my friends here giving this time. It's been so wonderful, very rich, and even some of the things you're saying, I'm like, I'm gonna go back and see that episode again. So much there. So thank you, friends, for just being there and being present to process with me. There's nothing more rewarding than seeing something really great and then having friends to talk to about it, just to like unpack it with. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining. Kind of a different sort of episode for JBC Connect. Hope you enjoyed it and hope there's more to come. So thank you, friends, for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for having us. We
Yeah.
really appreciated being here.
All right.
peace be with you all.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care.